It was a fever of activity that morning, a culminating symphony of relationships invested in over the past 11 years. Faces from different aspects of our life. They were coworkers, neighbors, friends, former students, softball buddies, some who had been there since the beginning, and others who had become a part of our life halfway through. And they had all descended upon 1522 Vassar Drive that Saturday morning. You see, because today was the day. Today was moving day. And that day was much like the emotional journey one is taken on in a symphony. Up and down, fast and slow, a series of contrasting emotions. We stacked box upon box, furniture piece turned this way and that, an endless game of life-size Tetris, all the while laughing and crying alongside one another as we reminisced of the memories. With each box packed, another memory was placed along with it, some to be taken with us and opened back up, while others, like the objects in them, were to remain in the box as just that, packed up and stored away, never to be opened again. Eventually, that house, once full of boxes and furniture and life, was now empty. And one by one, those faces said their goodbyes, until only they remained. You see, the Milliken family had been there through it all, highs and lows, triumphs and failures, wins and losses, agonizing over major life decisions, births of children. Well, you get it. They shared in our everything. And that's what made that goodbye so difficult. You see, we were just knit together in a really special way, undeniably connected, proven by the rainfall of tears that were shed that afternoon. For each of you listening or watching today, I wonder, do you have that person? You know, if you were with us for our This Is Us sermon series in November, this type of person would have fallen into that innermost circle that we called intimacy. For those of you hearing this for the first time, here's a really quick recap. Credit to J.D. Greer for this. Each circle represents the levels of friendship in our life. In the innermost circle, intimacy, you have a small group of friends, probably 3 to 5, that profoundly shape and impact you. And you, them, someone who loves Jesus as much, or if not more than you do. But more on that in a bit. In the next circle, influence, you have a large number of friends. You influence them, they influence you, but they're not inner circle tight, who you would call at like 2 a.m. In the outermost circle, care, these people are the ones that you invest energy in and care for, but in reality, you're not really hanging together all that often. You know, we were challenged back then to do an inventory of our relationships and where each of them fell in relation to those 3 circles of our life, especially that innermost circle of intimacy. And if you're like me, I struggled to truly come up with an inner 3, let alone 5. If you were to have that question posed to you now, how would you respond? Who's in your inner circle? You know, maybe a face and a name immediately flood forward in your mind, and with it a deep well of emotions. For others, however, maybe it's a face that is shadowed by the days gone by, features unable to be made out anymore because of the passing of time, distant and only tethered by the circles of social media, constantly reliving or even living in the memories of the once was. Or maybe you can honestly say that you've never had a friendship like that. Silently longing for someone with whom you could grow together, develop and delight in together, a bond forged by such intimacy that others would pause and long for that in their lives as well. Essentially, someone who comes to know your soul. But have you ever wondered how all that happens? How it starts? How to continue in it? What it takes? Well, that's why I love our passage today, because I think it provides a richness of truths that we can use to take and apply to our desire for a connection on that level. And for this message today, I want you to bring to mind the closest friend you've got right now. Bring them to mind, seriously. I want you to keep that person in the forefront of your mind as we enter into our story today and throughout our message. And so we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 1 and going to verse 5. And I want to acknowledge the works of Tim Keller and Scott Keith for some of the inspiration for this message today. Now, before we jump in, I think we should get a bit more background leading up to this point in our passage today. You know, the first book of Samuel tells the story of Israel's transition from a theocracy, or a state ruled by a religious leader, to a monarchy, or a state ruled by a political leader. Each stage of this transition is depicted through the narratives of 3 main figures. Samuel represents the old rule of the judges, Saul represents Israel's failed attempt at a monarchy, and David represents God's ideal king. You see, Israel starts out as a nation of loosely affiliated tribes who are led by priests and religious heroes, but it becomes a nation-state led by a centralized king, mainly as a result of the outcry of the people of Israel. And while God condemns the request, he inevitably gives them what they ask for, with a warning label, of course, and appoints Samuel, the current priest, to name Saul king. And so Saul starts out well with these early victories against the surrounding enemies on all sides, most notably the Philistine army. And his son, Jonathan, a mighty warrior and commander in his own right, and heir to Saul's throne, might I add, gets an eyewitness account on Dad's character, a character that drives the decisions behind his continual disobedience of God's commands. And as a result, Samuel rebukes Saul, claiming that obedience to God's instructions and commands is more important than anything else. And so he informs Saul that God will choose another man to be king of Israel. And Saul pleads with Samuel. He's begging for forgiveness. I mean, he even goes as far to grab for Samuel's cloak as he's walking away, but the cloth tears. And Samuel turns around and he says, "That is a symbol of the broken kingdom taken from your hands, Saul." Enter the third man, the main character of our story, David. See, God leads Samuel to the town of Bethlehem to choose a new king from Jesse's family. Each of Jesse's older sons are impressive, but God instructs Samuel to judge people not by their external appearances, but rather by their hearts. So Samuel anoints Jesse's youngest son, David, a shepherd, as king. And God gives divine power to David. God withdraws his power from Saul, cursing Saul with psychological distress in the form of an evil spirit. And David begins his rise to courtly status, first as a harp player for Saul during the king's emotional unrest. And the story eventually culminates the story of David and Goliath, the mighty Philistine giant that David kills with a stone. With their mighty warrior dead, the Philistines flee, and David is brought before Saul. And that's where we pick up our story today. Y'all ready? It's going to be good. Okay, here we go. Let's read 1 Samuel, start in 18, starting in verse 1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul sent him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. At first glance, this doesn't sound like one of those outer ring type friendships, does it? I mean, in 5 short verses, there's multiple uses of the word love. There's this talk of a covenant being made, and there's even this strange exchange of clothing that takes place. And if that is a determinant for an inner circle level relationship, then I hate to break it to many of you out there that I'm friends with on Facebook. You're not in my inner 3. I've seen your style. I wouldn't be caught in those threats of yours. Seriously, though. This is the kind of friendship that is that inner circle type of relationship. I mean, we're talking soul sister, blood brother type level friendship. And what I want us to see is that the bond between David and Jonathan is a bond that God has created us for, mirrored by the bond that is shared between God, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that Jesus ultimately models himself. And this bond between the closest of friends provides a framework for us today on what it means to love someone as yourself. And we're going to use an illustration that plays off the ones that we just referenced, but we're going to repackage them a bit more in the form of true concentric circles. It's what I'm calling the 4 concentric circles of loving someone as yourself. I know, real short title. But here's the cool thing about concentric circles. By definition, what makes them concentric is the fact that each circle fits inside one another with the same distance apart all the way around, and most importantly, all sharing the same center. Picture the ripple effect of a pebble when dropped in water. And as you will see, each step towards the center comes with a choice, and that at the very center lies the key to loving someone as yourself, the truest and purest form of friendship. So let's step into that first circle and that first choice you must make, and it's this. In order to experience it, you've got to initiate it. Now let me be clear, this type of initiation isn't the equivalent of sending them a friend request or a request to follow you. This type of initiation is preceded by recognizing a certain set of values in someone or how someone carries themselves. And if I'm a betting man, I think Jonathan saw what God saw, that David was a man after God's heart. And I think Jonathan was so drawn to David because he had finally met someone who lived like him in word and deed. You see, both were courageous, mighty warriors. Both had a heart that beat fast for the Lord, and both wanted to desperately free the Israelites from the oppression of the Philistine army. Now let me stop right there for a second. Bring to mind your closest friend again for a moment. Think back to how it all started and what drew you two together. Now, I don't know what that is, and I'm sure it looks different for all of us, but there's always a backstory leading up to the moment where that friendship begins. Along the way, you probably even asked others something like, hey, what can you tell me about so-and-so? You see, you want to confirm and check what you are initially drawn to. And for those of you who really don't have that inner circle type of person, let me frame it this way. Who are you drawn to like Jonathan was to David? Someone whose values you admire, the way they carry themselves, interact with others, and just demonstrates the passion to be more like Jesus. Better yet, who do you feel God is drawing you to be in relationship with? And no, I'm not talking about the romantic kind. You know, isn't it funny that many of us ask and pray to God over and over for that special someone? But have you ever prayed to God for a Jonathan in your life? Seriously, and listen, I'm talking to myself on this one as much as I am to each of you. Wrestle hard with that question. What's stopping you? Because I think we all need a Jonathan in our life, to grow in life together, to allow them into the innermost parts of our story. But so often we don't, and the why most often has something to do with time, or it being too much work, or you've been burned before and have the scars to show for it. But here's the problem, as we learned in week 1 of our series, we were made for connection. But we will never experience it until we initiate it. So initiate it. Call someone up, someone who you know that has good values and principles. Ask God for who that someone is for you. Be intentional, and then make sure you keep it going once it starts. Which brings us to our second circle of choice. Let's turn back to our illustration. You see, commitment is what keeps it going. How many of you had a friendship where you felt this immediate bond? You know, like Thelma and Louise type level? Guys, sorry, that would be like Band of Brothers or Tombstone in our context. You're singing Mamma Mia, staying up late, hanging out, talking about how awesome you were in high school. You're doing TikTok videos together, but then, like overnight, it just flames out like a dud in a firework display. Wah, wah. I mean, what happened? Maybe you just saw that it was going to be too much work, that you seemed like you were given way more than receiving and pieced out before it got too draining. Too much energy, not enough time. Or maybe you were the one on the other end and you're the one who didn't see it coming. And if we're honest, it's a bit painful, isn't it? Painful because of the time invested, the vulnerability. But you just struggle at times to connect. It's hard. And just when you think you're making headway, boom, they don't have time for you anymore. Then that familiar feeling returns, loneliness. And with it, you etch another notch in the belt of disappointment. Retreat back to the comfort and safety of the glow from your screen. Because let's just face it, it's easier and safer to forge friendships by liking or loving or showing you care with a click. But here's the thing. Friendships aren't forged by the number of clicks. They're forged by great commitment. And Jonathan demonstrates this idea of great commitment with a powerful symbol. Look at verse 3. It says, "Then Jonathan made a covenant with David." Now, the word for covenant here literally translates to the phrase cut a covenant. And while this is very familiar in Old Testament time and culture, it can be pretty foreign to us in our present time. But it's important for us to take a couple of minutes to get a clearer understanding of the significance of the covenant. You see, a covenant was an agreement typically enacted between two parties, where one or both parties make promises under oath to perform or refrain from certain actions. And so they would take an animal and they would literally cut the animal in half. And then they would walk between the two halves, effectively saying, if I am unfaithful to my word in this covenant, may I end up in pieces as this animal. More often than not, these covenants would be made out of fear or to create an alliance of peace between nations. But the unique feature of David and Jonathan's covenant, however, was that it was made out of love, specifically a love that Jonathan had for David. It was a level of friendship very rarely seen. I love how the Living Bible translation phrases it. Jonathan swore to be his blood brother. And the word picture in play here is conveying a much closer bond than the word friend in our modern culture. In essence, this friendship, as one ancient writer put it, was an entire sameness and oneness of soul. Think of the significance of this. Jonathan is saying, hey bro, I'm all in. My heart is yours. I will be your 2 a.m. phone call. I will be your security, your confidant, your trusted and loyal, even to the point of shedding of blood. I will fiercely protect what is yours, defend and honor those who you defend and honor, for your sake and not mine. I will delight in you and also not be afraid to develop you. Now put yourself in this story for a second. I want you to picture that someone who you consider a really good friend standing on the other side of this pact. Is this person willing to make that type of commitment? Better yet, are you willing to make that type of commitment to them? To say when things get hard, to show up when the stuff gets real? Someone who delights in your triumphs and shares in your failures. And here's the thing, we learn a bit later on with David and Jonathan, loving someone as yourself type friends not only delight in you, they also develop you. They see you for who you can become, drive you to be better. They push you. They are someone who doesn't shy away from truth even when they know it may cost them a bit because it wounds you a bit. And most likely, they know that you're going to be angry at them for a while as a result of it. So think of that person of yours, and let me ask you something. Has this disconnected time bolstered your commitment to one another in the midst of this trying time? Because the greatest of friendships are forged in the midst of the trial and the test, where the roads of commitment and sacrifice converge, which leads us to our third choice, our third circle of choice to step into. At some point, you're going to have to sacrifice for it. Look again at verse 4. It says, "And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt." Don't just read this as Jonathan not being able to fit into his clothes anymore and giving David his hand-me-down so he could go hit the outlets. This is tremendously symbolic because Jonathan was giving his identity to David. When Jonathan gave David his robe, it symbolized his position. When Jonathan gave David his garments, it symbolized his possessions. And when he gave his sword and his bow, it symbolized his power. In essence, Jonathan is renouncing his position as crown prince and transfers the right of succession to David. So David here is literally putting on the identity and privileges of Jonathan. All that he was, all that he had, he laid it down for the sake of another. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Don't miss the parallel to Jesus here. You see, Jesus demonstrates his sacrificial covenant with us, living out his very own words of love thy neighbor as yourself. He stepped down from his exalted position as the only begotten Son of God, as Paul carefully outlines in Philippians 2, verses 6 and 7, when it says, "Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men." You see, Jesus stripped himself of his position in heaven, his robe of divinity, if you will, as co-equal with God, in order to take on the robe of humanity, to become clothed with our rags. And some of you, by the end of this message today, will come to see that Jesus' sacrifice included you. And that level of sacrifice gets me every time because I don't deserve it because of how selfish I inherently am. And when I put myself in Jonathan's shoes, I'll be honest, I don't know how far I would have gone. I know that I would like to think that I would sacrifice much, but let's make it personal for a second. Think of your favorite t-shirt. Would you part with that? Okay, all right, seriously. No, seriously. What about your new phone? Or how about that car? You know, maybe your friend really needs a vacation. Would you hand over your week stay at the ocean because they just need it more than you? And here's the crazy thing. I already feel the tractor beam of Scott the Selfish begin to draw my eyes inward and my hands outward to reach for those things with a tighter grip before they get away. And that's just over the material possessions, man. I mean, I sit here and ask myself, how willing am I to shoulder the hard stuff? What about you? You know, the emotional, the physical, the mental toll of sacrifice, the sacrifice kind of hard stuff. And I'm not talking about sacrifice only to the point of your comfort, because that's still being selfish, to be clear. I'm saying, are you willing to risk having to be disliked for a time because you need to stand alongside your friend when so many are choosing not to? To carry them for a period of time from the emotional wreckage that they have endured? To put on the anguish that they feel because the doctor said that there is nothing more that she can do? Are you that kind of friend who would drop everything and be with them when they're in trouble? Because that's what Jonathan does for David. Jonathan literally is the poster child for Proverbs 17:17 that says, "A true friend and a brother loves at all times and is always there in times of trouble." And if you read chapters 19 and 20 in 1 Samuel, David was in some trouble. When you have the time, read the lengths to which Saul goes to try and have David killed. I mean, it's pretty remarkable how many ways and how many different people Saul tries to outfit with killing David. In the midst of all of this, we see that Jonathan risks and sacrifices it all: his power, his possessions, and his position for David's benefit. He wasn't just all talk, filling David with empty promises. He walked the walk. He sacrificed. Not because he felt obligated to, but because he literally loved David as himself and came to experience the rich intimacy of the purest type of friendship. Which brings us to our innermost circle of choice, and it's this. Loving someone as yourself means that you're going to need to get intimate. Remember, Jonathan gave his very being to David. And after he gets shunned by his dad for foiling his deceitful plan to having David killed, Jonathan and David meet one last time, realizing that it isn't safe for David to stick around town anymore. In the later verses of chapter 20 in 1 Samuel, David comes out of hiding in a field, and he bows down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. They kiss each other, and they weep together. And I love that it says, but David wept more. I mean, what a bookend to the outpouring commitment that Jonathan showed on the outset to David in chapter 18. And Jonathan's parting words to his friends in verse 42 says this. It says, go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town. Here we see the full picture of the impact of intimacy. And I want us to recognize that our world has made us think that intimacy is reserved only for those relationships that are sexual in nature. We cannot be more wrong, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, we don't have the time to turn there, but let me show you what David writes about his friend when he learns that he has been killed. In 2 Samuel, in the first chapter, David says this in verse 26. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of a woman. Now, before you go there, let me unpack that. Let's go back into their culture. You see, oftentimes with a king that would get married, many times those marriages would be political marriages, and oftentimes never made it to the center of our circle illustration. I mean, heck, they probably didn't even make it past the first or second circle. And so what David is saying is that Jonathan wasn't like that mail-ordered bride. He was, in fact, a true, deep friend. And this passage has sometimes been twisted over the last couple of decades by people to try to say, well, look, they loved each other deeply, and they shared emotions with each other, so there must have been a romantic or some sort of sexual attraction going on. But that's not all what it means, gang. You see, the Hebrew word for love in this context is the verb ahab, and it is often used to describe God's love for his children, as we see in Hosea 11, verse 1. And when it says, when Israel was a youth, I loved him. And it's used to describe human love for God, as seen in Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And it's the same verb used to describe the love commanded by God and said by Jesus himself when he says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Remember, this was the whole reason why Jonathan formed a covenant with David in the first place. It wasn't out of fear or political gain. It was made out of love. The soul exposing, fully sharing, giving of your soul for someone to truly know you, to share your being with someone on an intimate level. And this is where it gets weird for us guys. To all the women out there, bear with me for a bit. Fellas, let's be honest. You've been cool with the first 3 circles. You get it more or less and can kind of relate. But this one, you ain't jiving with. Maybe even instituting the slow backpedal out of the conversation. I mean, I think the exchange probably would go something like this. Yo, Scott, I mean, there is no way you would ever hear me as a man say to someone, oh yeah, bro, Dave and I mean, we've totally got an intimate relationship between us. I mean, that is the farthest thing from what being a man is all about, isn't it? I don't know. Is it? I mean, because the last time I checked, a man was a man's man. What the heck does that even mean anyway? Well, you know it means I hunt, I fish, I camp, I work with my hands, I don't show emotion. Bros for life, brotherhoods of the gridiron, warriors in battle. Oh, you mean like the mighty warriors of David and Jonathan who took on armies by themselves? Yeah, I'm a man. Wait, did you say David and Jonathan? Yeah, you know, David who killed 200 Philistine barbarians and took all their foreskins back to Saul as the price for marrying his daughter? And you thought asking your future father-in-law's blessing was intimidating. Let me be clear, y'all. I'm not male bashing here. I mean, last time I checked, I've got my man card, and no, I'm not going down that rabbit hole. I'm simply asking you to pause for a moment so you don't miss this. Being a man is a both and, not an either or. You see, our definition of what a man is has been so greatly entangled and infiltrated by the cancer of culture. methodically warped and morphed with each passing generation. You see, David and Jonathan show us that you can be both a mighty, courageous warrior and express love for another. Guys, do you have that type of dude in your life? If you don't, you need to get connected with other men. We've got some really cool ways to do that coming up at the end of the month. Now, females, you're not off the hook, because I think you know that while each intimate friendship is unique, all of them share one common ingredient, and that is trust. Men sitting next to the woman who said that before I did, take notes. Okay, sorry. Back to all you amazing females out there. But you've been burned before, haven't you? Your trust compromised, and with it your desire to be all in, to give all of you. And let's be honest, this is where most of you fall short, only willing to share the 98% of who you are and what you're willing to let in. But you see, in order to experience the purest form of friendship, you've got to be willing to give the last 2%. But so often, though, we don't. Why? Because it's hard, because it's messy, because it's uncomfortable, because it requires vulnerability, and so it's just revealing all of you. And so it's just okay to let them close, but still not all the way in. But you see, that is where all of us must go, all the way to the center, which brings us to the very center of our circle. Remember what we said at the beginning? By definition, concentric circles share the same center, which means that if you and I are to truly experience a friendship of loving someone as ourselves, then our closest friendships must share the same center, a center that is unshakable and immovable from the tumultuous stages of life, a stability that only comes from a life built on the rock of Jesus. Because as Jonathan Holmes states, a friendship built on anything less cannot bear the same fruit, survive the same tests, or deliver the same satisfaction. And yes, I know what that is implying. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have friendships with those who don't share the same center. On the contrary, you should continue to be a loving example of Jesus to them and allow your very own fragrance of the Spirit to extend outward into their lives. It may very well bring them along to the point of choosing to make Jesus the center of their life one day. But what I am saying is that your inner three should share the same center. Because friendships who share the common center of Christ put on display the gospel of sacrifice and grace for the world to see. And so here's what I'm asking. Does that friend you pictured in your mind in the beginning of this message share the same center? Does that friend spur you on to a deeper level of intimacy with Jesus? My hope is that they do. And if they don't, or if you don't have that person, I want to challenge you to go before the Lord and ask for that type of friend to enter into your life. Not only that, ask him to begin to shape and mold you into the very type of friend you are looking for, because that which you seek for, you must first become. And lastly, to those who don't have Jesus as the center of your circle, here's what you need to hear. You were created to be in relationship with him. He loves you so much that he took your sin upon himself so that you could have eternal life with him. Hear this. It was something he initiated, something he stayed committed to, even when the entire world turned against him. And he paid the ultimate sacrifice in the form of his life for yours, nailed to a cross. You see, you're his child, and he would have nothing stand in his way to show you that he desires to share in the most intimate relationship with you. Why? It's simple, really. Because he loves you like he loves himself. And all he asks in return is for you to choose and make him your center. So here's what I'm asking you to do by the way of the next step. Take out your phone and text the word Grace Next to 94090. And when you receive a text back, you'll have a choice. If today is the day you want to take to make Jesus the center of your life and follow him for the first time, choose number 1. I want to follow Jesus. And for those of you who are not connected to a life group, whether it's couples, singles, men or women, now is the time. Choose number 2. That very well be the place where you find your Jonathan or your David. And don't forget to check out the additional resources we made available to you at whoisgrace.com/reconnected. Finally, let us remember these words Jesus told his disciples before he went to the cross. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all that I've heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you. God bless you guys, and happy Father's Day to all you dads out there.